AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers and those who write about them. And today I have a really remarkable guest. His name is Jeffrey Rogg. He has a PhD in American intelligence history. He was an assistant professor at the Joint Special Operations University and the Citadel. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the U.S. Naval War College. He currently sits on the boards of the International Journal for Intelligence and Counterintelligence and the Society of Intelligence History. He's on his way to Austin, Texas, where he's going to be an assistant professor at the Clements Center for National Security in Austin. And he has a book out just a year ago entitled The Spy and the State, The History of American Intelligence. Jeff, welcome to AFIO Now.
Thanks, Jim. Great to be with you and to be with AFIO again.
So, Jeff, this is a very comprehensive book. It literally covers the entire history of U.S. intelligence from the Revolutionary War onward. For our audience, what characterized intelligence collection and dissemination both in the Revolutionary War and the U.S. Civil War?
That's a great question to ask on the 250th, anniversary of the United States. A lot of us are looking back to the American Revolution. And one of the things it lets me do is explain longer trends in American intelligence history. One of the things that you'll notice is a lot of intelligence history is it's fun spy stories, it's fun anecdotes, but you don't really see explanation over time. So that's a great entry question because the transition from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War, I use to help us understand how intelligence changed. So first in the American Revolution, there's actually a road not taken we can talk about. So you see two competing models of how the United States would later perhaps try and do intelligence already being tested, I guess we can say, during the American Revolution. First, the common one that we all probably think about is George Washington and Turin, Washington's spies. There's a book and there's a TV show about it, and the Culper ring and all these different spy rings that Washington, Benjamin Talmadge, and a couple other, notable people during the American Revolution were managing. So what you see there is this commander-in-chief model. In other words, you have a figurehead who then has these spy rings around them that report to him. But alongside that, as a parallel possible model, the Continental Congress had created something called the Committee for Secret Correspondence. And its job was both diplomacy and intelligence. You had Ben Franklin on it, John Jay, Robert Morris. So there were still big people, big names in the Revolution. But their job was to send American diplomat spies over to France. And they performed both diplomatic functions and intelligence functions. They collected information. They tried to figure out what the ground game was in terms of where European states were going with support for the revolutionaries or not. But they also were running covert operations, privateering operations. So what I try and explain is you see two different models for how we would do intelligence in the future. Would it be done through the Congress and through a committee system in Congress? Or would it be done as an executive function by someone like a commanding general? That's ultimately the model that we adopted. And one of the reasons why, and we can talk about this, is Congress couldn't keep a secret. And so the members of the Committee of Secret Correspondence, they didn't want to share information with the Continental Congress. And then even within their own committee, there were rivalries that made it so that people didn't even share information within the committee. This is probably something familiar to your audience already in their own experience today. And I'm here to tell you it was already happening in the American Revolution. So the model that ultimately triumphs is the model that George Washington adopts when he's president. And that's intelligence is an executive function. And the Congress even votes for it and says, we're going to give you a special fund every year called the Contingent Fund for Foreign Intercourse, the Secret Service Fund. And you're going to basically do intelligence however you see fit, and you don't have to report the details to us, the Congress. So that's already a road not taken in American intelligence history that has drastic effects down the road. And the way that we see this evolve from the Contingent Fund for Foreign Intercourse is, so intelligence is a presidential function. We all probably still think of it mainly that way today. There was very little congressional oversight, but then something big happens with the Civil War. During the Civil War, that war is it's bigger than any other war in previous American history. Lincoln can't micromanage intelligence himself the way Washington did during the American Revolution. And you already had these large executive departments, the State Department, you had the Navy Department, and you had the War Department. So they're using the Secret Service Fund. And now what you see is, when I explain this in the book, the departmentalization of American intelligence. So intelligence control slips from the president to these big executive departments. So now they're the ones, they hire their own detective spies with the War Department or diplomat spies with the State Department, and they're getting fed the intelligence from overseas or the intelligence from within the Army. And there's also these departmental silos, which, again, your audience is probably familiar with. So the big change that I try and explain in the book, and this goes to this evolution of the American intelligence system, is how our origin point with the Revolutionary War set us on this course for executive control. And then you see control over intelligence start to fracture to these executive departments by the time the Civil War happens. And this is going to lead us in the long term to the First World War, the Second World War, and then the actual formation of the CIA to coordinate intelligence as an executive function.
What were some of the weaknesses of intelligence collection and dissemination during World War II?
So that's a continuation of the story. And again, this is what I think is valuable in understanding intelligence history for more than just some really fun spy stories, understanding how we get to where we are today. So we had this departmentalization of intelligence, I call it, from basically the Civil War to the Second World War. And you see the early formation of the U.S. intelligence community after the Civil War. That's when you actually see the Office of Naval Intelligence, Army G2. It was the bureau that you had, like, different bureaus that were established. But the Secret Service is formed, FBI. By the time you have the Second World War, you have all these departmental intelligence organizations. They don't communicate or cooperate very well, though, which we're all familiar with. So ahead of the Second World War, something that was remarkable to me in reading a lot of the documents by officials is they all knew, these are heads of the intelligence community as it was at the time, they all knew the system was dysfunctional. They knew that they were conducting redundant intelligence operations. We didn't have a formal foreign espionage function. No one truly charged with that. ONI did, and Army G2 did through their attaché system. The FBI was dabbling with it. But that's a big blind spot for us. And then SIGINT is just even siloed from within them. I mean, it's a super secret area of intelligence. So the big missing piece, and this is what takes us to the creation of the CIA, is intelligence coordination. And it's very clear to policymakers. I mean, this is well before 1947. This is on the road to 1947. It's very clear that we cannot have this disorganized, redundant, inefficient intelligence system following the Second World War when everyone knows that there's going to be a Cold War right after it.
So what were the principal drivers that led Truman to sign the National Security Act in September of 1947 after World War II?
You know, looking at the long march of the history, it was by that point, I would say almost like a fait accompli. The consensus had been reached that there would be a new Central Intelligence Organization, that this is the origins of the CIA. I like to say organization before I say agency, because again, what exactly that organization would look like was still up for grabs. And so a lot of the bartering, a lot of the bureaucratic knife fights, a lot of the serious and bitter rivalries, they had already had their moment during the Second World War. And so by the time this gets to Truman's desk, like it or not, a lot of the agreements have been made already within the, again, big executive departments. I want to trace it a little bit earlier than that, though, because this is major moments in American intelligence history, I guess we could call it. I guess that could be a TV show or its own book. And one of them was Wild Bill Donovan, William J. Donovan, who's the director of the OSS. But before that, he's appointed to something called the Office of the Coordinator of Information. And this is by FDR, Truman's predecessor. And Donovan and the COI and then OSS are really driving a lot of the discussion, partially because they're making so many enemies within the different executive departments. And Donovan writes what I think is one of the most important documents in American intelligence history. In November 18th, 1944, he writes a memorandum to FDR. And in it, he says two important things that need to happen. One, and this goes to my earlier point, basically intelligence control needs to be returned to the president. Everyone had realized that the president, it had slid away from the president to all these departments. So this is why I keep talking about this long arc of American intelligence history from the Revolution to the Civil War. Departmentalization helped in some ways, but it hurt in other ways. And one of the things that hurt was getting the information the president needed, not big department heads, not department bureaucratic policies and procedures, but what did the president need? And then also coordinating it. But so you have to return control to the president. And then here's where the second piece comes in. We need an organization that's going to coordinate intelligence. So even though there'd been this like drumbeat of debate, this memorandum in November 1944 kicks off the mother of all memorandum wars in American intelligence history. And through, again, a lot of bartering, everyone's involved because they all want to stake in this debate. The different departments, FBI is anyone who has any interest in intelligence. And so that is the major debate. And that was the major consensus that needed to be reached. And this is what actually, eventually what Truman signs on was a JCS, a Joint Chiefs of Staff plan. The JCS was one of the drivers of this debate too, because OSS was under the JCS during the Second World War. And what Truman eventually signs isn't really too far away what had been agreed upon even before Truman took office and before FDR had died. And so the one thing is, on the one hand, all this bureaucratic bartering and compromise had been determined. And the other thing is, and this is no small moment either, the onset of the Cold War. Everyone knew while they're arguing with each other, when you read these memoranda, the other thing they're saying is the war, not just the Second World War, but the war's not over yet. We're going to have a serious confrontation with the Soviet Union. And so it's like the perfect storm of both old historical drivers in American intelligence history and then true contemporary threats and exigencies that lead to this monumental moment in 1947.
So in the 1970s, some CIA missteps led to increased congressional oversight. How did that change things?
This is where being an American intelligence historian is interesting. I find myself sometimes in no man's land, I guess I'll call it, because there's two general dispositions that you'll find when you study intelligence and intelligence history. Academics and journalists, and this is going to tie into the 1970s, academics and journalists often are fairly critical of the intelligence community. And with some exceptions, there's some outliers who come from the IC and either they have it leaves a very bad taste in their mouth, or there's some seriously hurt feelings, and then they write books that blast the IC. It's not just a new thing. Victor Marchetti, The Cult of Intelligence, was a really big book blasting the CIA. But usually people who come from the IC are a little bit more defensive, and I don't blame them because they're just constantly being assailed. And so when I come in as an intelligence historian, it's kind of like on both sides, it's like, all right, what's this guy going to say looking at the entirety of American intelligence history? And to isolate the problems of the 1970s and even before that, the 1960s and 50s, and what the CIA was doing, and just pin it entirely on the CIA isn't really good history. because it doesn't account for all the variables. And so one of the missteps of the CIA, perhaps, was trusting that accountability would be spread across the board of all the different departments that were more than happy to have the CIA do, I guess, what we'll call sometimes the dirty work of statecraft. Again, I had already said during the Revolutionary War, we did covert action operations that people might have found controversial. This is true throughout American intelligence history. I mentioned in the book the annexation of Hawaii had elements of covert action in it that probably leaves a bitter taste in Native Hawaiians today. So when we talk about CIA missteps, we need to be careful and understand what the collective responsibility of policymakers, different departmental officials, leaders of the State Department, leaders of the Department of Defense by this time, Justice Department, and then yes, what was the CIA willing to do? Because ultimately the buck stops there when you raise your hand and say, yeah, we executed the operation. Everyone wanted us to, including Congress, by the way. Members of Congress were briefed as much as they wanted to learn about CIA operations during what we'll call the High Cold War. But usually the approach was, tell us enough so that we can say we were informed, but don't tell us so much that we can say we knew about the bad stuff too. So part of it was the CIA, and this is even earlier in 1947, the early Cold War, when we're looking at what the future is going to be, how we're going to fight this Cold War, we already had the evolution of, they called it psychological warfare during the Second World War, but then Kennan comes around and we know the Cold War as the era of political warfare. And the question is, organizationally, who's going to do it? And the State Department, I always talk about the second National Security Council meeting, this conversation comes up, and it wasn't the DoD yet, it was the National Military Establishment, but they basically say, we're not doing this psychological warfare stuff. The State Department says, we're not doing this. So the eyes all look at this new organization of former intelligence officers and OSS people, and it's like, but they're more than happy to, because the CIA is mission hunting. But here's the catch. The State Department and the Department of Defense, what would become the Department of Defense, they still wanted to ultimately control what the CIA did. So the agreement was the State Department would oversee covert action during times of peace, and the DoD would oversee it during times of war. So the natural arc of this is the CIA does covert action operations during the High Cold War that everyone agreed needed to be done, more or less. There was no argument. I mean, there was individuals who were like, maybe coups aren't such a good idea, but Eisenhower didn't disagree, and the Dulles brothers didn't disagree. And you probably, if you asked most of the country at the time, do you want us to counter the Soviet Union? They're going to say yes. They're scared. So it's not exactly, even though this is the mythology, is that the CIA was doing all these things, it was a rogue elephant, that really wasn't the true picture that emerges from early CIA operations. And the other important thing to remember is the real controversy that kicked off the Church Committee hearings in 1975 was an article by Seymour Hersh in December 1974 reporting that the CIA was spying on American citizens. So it wasn't even what the CIA was doing overseas that was truly the straw that broke the camel's back, the proverbial camel's back. It was domestic intelligence operations, and not just by the CIA, by the FBI, by the NSA. So what I extrapolate from this and try and remind, and this is for intelligence professionals, is you have to be very careful when it comes to what you do domestically. Overseas, Americans start to get, when you even look at polling today, if the threat's there, Americans are pretty good with us getting our hands dirty. But there's always this, but don't do what you do to them to me mentality. And so that's really a long-term trend. And that was the CIA's biggest misstep, is getting involved in the domestic intelligence stuff that honestly they weren't really supposed to do anyways. And everyone was telling them not to do in 1947.
So what are the tensions between national security and civil liberties?
That's the big question that emerges, isn't it? And it's one that I tackle throughout the book, because this question of liberty and security, again, it's greater than just intelligence. But when it comes to intelligence, the challenges of balancing them are particularly acute because of secrecy. That's one of the real, that's what separates intelligence really. I talk about it all the time. Even today, I know people are big on OSINT and transparency. I understand all that. But what makes intelligence different as a profession is that secrecy is integral to it. I challenge anyone to tell me that at what point, and in the much maligned intelligence cycle, or just in intelligence as an instrument of statecraft, do you not need an element of secrecy? You can get your information from open sources, but how you use that information, you're going to keep secret. An intelligence requirement coming from a policymaker, they probably don't want to go shouting to anyone who will listen, hey, I want to know this very specific detail about this very specific threat. So it's not just collection that can be secret. Analysis has elements of secrecy. Counterintelligence and covert actions certainly do. And that secrecy bit is what consistently, it rubs against that tradition in American governance that we need to know what our government's doing. You know, we talk about need to know in intelligence. Americans feel like they need to know what the government's doing. And so in this precarious balance between liberty and security, you have this X factor, secrecy. And it tilts the scales one way or another, where when Americans are feeling safe, we don't really think we need to keep all that many secrets, and we think that we should probably know most of what the government's doing. But when we're not feeling safe, when we feel insecure, that's when the balance really tilts, and it's like, hey, do whatever you need to do to keep me safe, and we'll worry about it later. But because it's kept secret, there's a half-life on secrecy. There's no such thing as a secret probably in American government, or we don't keep secrets very well. And sooner or later, when it comes out, if the American people feel safe at that moment in time, and whatever the US government did is objectionable in terms of American traditions, then it becomes a scandal, even if it wouldn't have been a scandal at the time. And you see this consistently throughout American intelligence history, is like reporting during wars and what the IC is doing during wars is always different than reporting during peace and how you cast the IC during peace. So, you know, I remind for practitioner audiences, I like to talk about Rudyard Kipling's Tommy this and Tommy that, and chuck him out the brute, but it's savior of his country when the guns begin to shoot. You have to have that element of Tommy where you're stuck in this never-ending battle, this tug of war between liberty and security. And the government and the American people are going to pull you one way or another, depending on circumstances. And this is where you just got to know the game you're in and roll with the punches. And sometimes that means taking it on the chin. And the IC, it takes it on the chin just as often as it gets a pat on the back.
Perhaps more often.
More often. Yeah, I was being a little too cheeky there. More often than not.
So describe to our audience this intelligence revolution that you see possibly coming in the future.
So that's the Intel revolution it's my own riff off something I studied as a military historian. In military history, and particularly at Ohio State, I'm supposed to say the Ohio State University, one of the grand theories of military history we talk about is the military revolution. And this, a lot of your audience are probably familiar through their workings with the military of the revolution in military affairs. So like RMAs, how technology changes or warfighting changes, and we need to adapt to that. But in military history, we talk about the military revolution, and in particular being a period of time in early to modern Europe, from about the 13th century to the 18th century, where a lot of revolutions in military affairs over that period, they accumulate. And the difference between an RMA and a military revolution is the RMA is kind of internal to the military. It's how changes in technology or doctrine or warfighting change how you fight wars. It changes wars. The military revolution is bigger than that. It's how did all these wars fundamentally transform the states and societies of Europe and lead to the modern European state system that we still see echoes of today. And how did it lead Europe, by the way, to dominate the world militarily? So when I looked at the arc of American intelligence history over 250 years, I started to see something interesting, which is revolutions in intelligence affairs, not just in the past 20 years, as we've talked about in intelligence studies, but revolution in intelligence affairs with, for instance, SIGINT, with the First World War, certainly, with the professionalization of intelligence and the creation of distinct military intelligence organizations in the 19th century. And then what I looked at is, how is this changing state and society? Intelligence is, we call it the joke about it being this world's second oldest profession, but it's really a fairly new one. And having true institutions of intelligence in countries, in modern countries, is a new thing. The way in which surveillance is so pervasive and how it's used, to me, what I'm seeing is an intelligence revolution. It's ongoing. It's not just in the future. It started probably in the mid 19th century with the creation of true intelligence organizations. It's progressed and even accelerated with certainly with the First World War and the Cold War intelligence competition. And now what we're looking at today is that intelligence is fundamentally transforming state and society. Look at China and the social credit system. They hope to use mass surveillance to fundamentally change the behavior of the people in their society. It's the combination of intelligence and surveillance with state and society. And even in the United States today, if you look at, for instance, ongoing events with how we fight wars, what our targeting allows us to do, and then concerns about with civil society, to me, a lot of these concerns aren't just anchored in warfighting in the military. It's in intelligence and surveillance, our ability to collect information and then how we use that information. And it's not just governments, it's also private corporations, because they collect just as much information, and in some cases more information than governments do. So what this says to me is we're in the middle of an ongoing intelligence revolution that is fundamentally changing state and society, and that includes the American way of life. And I'm not sure, based on how, looking at some of the scandals in the past and how the progression of technology is enabling intelligence collection and then the use of that intelligence collection for statecraft, I'm not sure if the Constitution as it is written is going to be as flexible. We've already seen constitutional crises involving intelligence, and again, domestic intelligence collection's the big one. I'm not sure the Constitution has the flexibility to really truly accommodate all the ways that not just the United States, but foreign adversaries are using intelligence. And can we stay competitive with them if we're not willing to do more? This is the perennial challenge of liberty and security, but it's newly packaged for humanity because the 21st century is going to be the most surveilled century in human history by far. And I don't think we're fully prepared for what that means. And I mean all of us, like not just in the United States, with other countries as well. So that's like kind of the big looming question mark that I leave the reader with, based on the entirety of American intelligence history and then contemporary events and looking forward.
What should our audience know about the state of U.S. intelligence history?
I'd say it's good. We should be happy, actually, that intelligence history, this is, again, the balancing act between secrecy and transparency. But if I were to looking at it and speaking to people from the IC, intelligence studies is bigger than it's ever been. There's always been people writing spy novels. I talk about the first spy novel, The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper. That's in 1822. But there's been periodic bursts of public interest in espionage. It always fascinates us. But today, it's not just public interest. Students are studying it, and they're eager to study it, and they want to join the intelligence community. So we have to harness this. And I earlier mentioned how there tends to be a degree of suspicion of intelligence with journalists and academics. The good news is, though, with intelligence studies, I see that suspicion and in some ways mythology. I see ways to moderate it, because now you have to treat it as a serious subject, and you have to actually look at how intelligence is a absolutely essential instrument of national security. And you have to understand it from the intelligence practitioner's perspective, not just the person, from the man in the arena perspective, not just from the journalist or the academic who's studying it and saying, well, why'd you do this? And you shouldn't have done that. So we're in a great place, I think, for bridging civil intelligence relations, as I call it, because now you actually have the serious study of intelligence in civil society. It doesn't mean that there's not challenges with disinformation. It doesn't mean the conspiracy theories are going anywhere. They aren't. We're in a worse information environment in that respect, but that's still balanced to me by what I see when I teach intelligence and when I speak, not just to a practitioner audience like AFIO, but to public audiences and their interest and their willingness to listen to someone say, you know, a lot of what you might have heard about the IC isn't exactly true. And oh, by the way, as Americans, we have a stake in this. So if I can leave your audience with something, it's I'm very optimistic about the state of intelligence history, the state of intelligence studies, and then the ability of organizations like AFIO to contribute to healthy dialogue between the public and American intelligence, the U.S. intelligence community, and intelligence professionals.
Yeah, I agree, Jeff. I think one of the better aspects of the last 50 or 60 years is literally an explosion of information about the U.S. intelligence community and intelligence as a profession. When I went to college all those years ago, basically the majors were history, poli-sci, and international relations, and that was it. There really weren't any other choices. And when I joined the agency in the early 70s, there was basically no public information about intelligence. And in fact, you almost had to be invited to join. You couldn't find the door without help. Today, 55 years later, not only is there a tremendous amount of public information, you actually apply to CIA online. And I'm very pleased to say that since its creation 51 years ago, AFIO really has played a really vital role in helping to expand public knowledge, public information about intelligence. And that's one of the reasons why I do what I do, but I think that's really, really important. I mean, some secrets need to be kept, but a lot of stories need to be told as long as they are told the right way, preserving the things that need to be protected, but letting the American public know some of the just incredible things that the heroes of the American intelligence community are doing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that's something that, again, living in this world of intelligence academics and intelligence history, I consider myself very lucky to have friends in the IC. And one of the things that it's almost a joke, but it's also sincere. I tell audiences, I don't know a single friend who wakes up in the morning working for the intelligence community saying, oh, I can't wait to do something that's going to harm my fellow Americans' civil liberties or do something that's going to make them feel ashamed to be American. I just don't see that. And so not only anecdotally, but also as an intelligence historian, when I look and see what the drivers are of some of the most controversial things the IC has done, a lot of the responsibility is still with us as citizens who elect officials who make intelligence policy, and they do, and oversee that. And so, again, we're in a better place, which is ironic considering how pessimistic a lot of people feel overall. I think we're in a better place when it comes to the study and practice of intelligence than perhaps we've ever been in American history.
Well, the name of the book is The Spy and the State, The History of American Intelligence. And I want to thank Jeff for a really fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Jim.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach program, visit www.afio.com.